Greetings to all my friends and colleagues and audience on the other side of the world. My name is Peter Manuelian. I'm a professor of Egyptology at Harvard University, and I'm here in the Boston area on the east coast of the United States. And I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of the work that we have done over many years at the famous Giza pyramids, perhaps the most famous archaeological site in the entire world. Today, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the site and some of the exploration that has taken place over many, many years. And here is an overview of what I hope to talk about today, some background of Giza, a brief excavation history. I will talk about the man who did most of the excavating at the site in the first half of the 20th century, George Reisner. We'll look at some of his most important discoveries, and then we'll talk about where we went, where we can go with all of that material after Reisner's death in 1942. And that includes some exciting new immersive technologies, VR and AR and other things. And then finally, I'll finish up trying to give some credit to the people who have not received much credit over so many years in Egyptology. I'm speaking about the Egyptians who did most of the excavating on these incredible expeditions. So I like to think about Giza as having three golden ages. The first golden age, of course, is in the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, about 2500 BCE. The second golden age is the first half of our 20th century, so from about 1900 to 1940 or 50, the great age of the Western expeditions, hundreds of workmen clearing so much debris all over the sites in up and down the Nile in Egypt and Sudan. And then what is the third golden age? Right now, so much great new technology, archaeological sciences, VR, AR, photogrammetry, modeling, so many ways we can ask new research questions. So it all goes back to the very, very beginning of Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition into Egypt and bringing materials home to Europe and starting the fever or Egyptomania craze. From then, we move on to one of the first serious archaeologists working at Giza first, and then many other sites as well. This is Flinders Petrie, of course, and he lived in a small rock-cut tomb not far from the Great Pyramid itself as he was doing his explorations in the early 1800s. I'm skipping over many of the early explorers, of course. From Flinders Petrie, the British explorer, we move on to our own George Reisner. Reisner was very interested in ancient history and Assyriology when he began his career. He was a Harvard student, class of 1889, and then he went to Berlin for a while, back to Harvard to teach, and then he came to Cairo in the late 1800s to work on the Cairo Museum collection. And then his career took a very big change. He met a rich American philanthropist named Phoebe Hearst, and she was looking to support archaeologists. And so he decided to change careers from being a language person to being an archaeologist. And he worked at many different sites in Upper Egypt, that's to the south of the country, and he became expert in his archaeological technique. And then by about 1903, the famous Giza pyramids became available. And these are the men who all wanted a piece of the action: a German expedition, an Italian expedition, and Reisner and the American expedition. So here we are looking at a model straight down at the site. North is to the right, west is to the top, and the three pyramids are built in order: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. So this is Dynasty 4 of the Old Kingdom. And the three expedition leaders, Italian, German, and American, were told to meet on the veranda of the famous Mina House Hotel next to the pyramids and divide the site up amongst them. So in the upper right, you can see in the colored area here, this is the original arrangement. The yellow was the American area, the blue was the German, and the orange was the Italian. But you'll see down below things changed, and the Italians wanted to work somewhere else. So they left Giza, and George Reisner and the Americans inherited their areas too. You see so much more yellow down below. So 2/3 of this Great Western Cemetery, all of the Eastern Cemetery, and the pyramid complex of King Menkaure, the third and smallest one. So George Reisner was very lucky. He lived at the pyramids. That was his only home. When he came home to teach at Harvard University or to be a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, he did not own any property. He couldn't wait to get back to Giza and to his beloved dig house called Harvard Camp. Here he is meeting the King of the Belgians, King Albert, and also Pierre Lecoq, the head of the Antiquities Service. Who was George Reisner? Well, as I mentioned, member of the class of 1889 at Harvard University, and his influence really came in this building from his professor, David Gordon Lyon, the very first Assyriologist. So Reisner was studying Akkadian, cuneiform texts, biblical Hebrew, when he was a Harvard undergraduate. Then he went on to Berlin after his PhD, and he studied with all of these great German professors. You see their names in yellow, and all the Arabic and other languages that Reisner studied. But it was in Berlin that he met the great Egyptologists Adolf Ehrman and Kurt Zeta, and that's where he learned the Egyptian language, Egyptian history, and archaeology, and so he was ready with this whole new field. And as I mentioned, after coming back to Harvard, he then went to Cairo and met Phoebe Apperson Hearst, and she was the one who hired him from 1899 to 1904 to become an archaeologist and dig in Egypt. And eventually, Giza became available. So here is the beginning of Reisner's work. This is a view of the Great Western Cemetery. So the Great Pyramid is behind us, and we are looking at the mastaba field. So these are the tombs of the high officials and governing elites. And you see in the upper photograph, almost nothing has been cleared. And just a few months later on in 1904, look at all the tombs that have been cleared. And the area I've circled just shows you the hill, so you can compare the before and after. Well, George Reisner had an amazing archaeological career. He worked at all of the sites that you see in red here. So up and down the Nile, not just in Egypt, but also in the Sudan as well. 23 different archaeological sites, more than 40 years. And here is just a selection of the amazing objects that he discovered. These are now in Cairo, in Khartoum, and in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and also at Harvard University. There were amazing texts on papyrus and on stone, incredible stele, historical texts, administrative texts, medical texts. In 1911 and 12, Reisner was the first to figure out who the Sphinx belonged to. From his excavations at the pyramids and the temples, he realized that the Sphinx belonged to King Khafre. But then the press went crazy and they started to assume that he was saying all kinds of amazing things like hidden chambers inside the Sphinx and the lost city of Atlantis underneath. And unfortunately, Reisner could never tell them, no, that has nothing to do with scholarship, and I never said that. Well, Reisner worked for many, many decades at Giza and also in Sudan, and even for 2 seasons in Samaria, Palestine. But by the 1930s, he was suffering from terrible eye problems, and he was going blind from about 1933 on. I have put together his signature from the early years at the top down to his later years at the bottom, and you can see that he can no longer see what he's doing when he's writing. But he never stopped working. He kept on going. In fact, he died at the pyramids at his beloved dig house called Harvard Camp in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War. He had sent his wife and his daughter home to America in the early 1940s. You can still see some of the debris-moving railway tracks and carts around the site. And in fact, I was just in Cairo in February, and we celebrated the restoration of George Reisner's gravestone, which is in the American Cemetery today. To decide what kind of influence and importance this man had, we can make an important list here. He made so many contributions to our history of the Old Kingdom, understanding dynasties 4, 5, and 6, the funerary architecture, the high officials of the Giza necropolis, studying the mastaba tombs, the inscriptions, the decoration. He also did something very similar down south for the Sudan, for ancient Nubian history. He established many, many generations, hundreds of years of chronology for Nubian kings and queens, and excavated many pyramid fields there as well. He also modernized archaeological methods. He was one of the first responsible scientific archaeologists, and that meant documentation. So photographs and diaries and notes and plans and drawings and publications, a huge amount of archaeological material. He trained many Western archaeologists from England and America, and they went on to work in both the Old World, in Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and also in the New World, in Latin America, for example, as well. But he also trained many Egyptians to work too, and he had Egyptian foremen, or rais in Arabic, and they worked at other expeditions later, not only Egypt and Sudan, but in the Levant and in Iraq. So Reisner had a huge influence on archaeology over a large area. Did he make mistakes? Yes, he did. He misinterpreted some of the archaeology, particularly in the south at the Nubian site of Kerma by the Third Cataract. He thought it was an Egyptian outpost, but in fact it was an indigenous African Nubian kingdom. And when we talk about the first half of the 20th century, we can talk about different kinds of Western colonialism and even racism. And Reisner was a man of his time, in some ways very progressive and thinking ahead, in other ways very typical. So, for example, he couldn't quite understand that the Nubians could have their own great indigenous African civilization. He thought they must be Egyptian immigrants or Libyans coming down to the south. And in terms of the modern era that he worked in, he believed that the British rule in Egypt made good sense for law and order, and he was not ready to see the Egyptians as prepared to run their own country. So remember, during these days, the British were controlling the government in Egypt, and the French were controlling the Antiquities Service. Well, so much of what Reisner found went to the Cairo Museum. A lot of it came here to Boston, to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Harvard University got his collection of detective novels. This was the only hobby he had. The only thing he did when he was not working was reading detective novels. And I looked at all of them in the Harvard Library, about 2,000 or 3,000 of them, because he graded them. He actually gave them grades on the inside, like an A- or a B+, or sometimes a D or an X if he didn't like them very much. So on this plan, we can look at the different years that Reisner was working at Giza, and you can see he started up in the Western Cemetery, and we saw that comparison photo of how much debris he cleared away. He moved slowly eastwards, and then he moves over to the Menkaure temple complexes. One of the great discoveries he made was in 1905, when Phoebe Hearst had just told him that because of financial difficulties, she could no longer support the dig. And this was a huge problem to him. He had to struggle and scramble and eventually replace his Phoebe Hearst expedition with the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition. And this is the expedition he directed all the way until his death. But it was ironic and perhaps bittersweet for him that Phoebe Hearst visited to Giza, and she left in March of 1905 in this morning, and in the afternoon he found the thing that you see the white arrow pointing to. When they removed the plaster covering, it was one of the greatest Old Kingdom stelae or gravestones ever found. I'm using Photoshop now to show you a color photo of it. This is called a slab stela, so it's a simple gravestone of a man named Wepem Nefret. There are only 3 of these that survive with all of their paint intact. And in the red circle, I'm showing you the spelling mistake that is actually on the Wepem Nefret stela. That is the word for wine, and they've gotten some of the hieroglyphs mixed up. But it's an absolute masterpiece. It is in Berkeley, California today because this stela was found during the Hearst expedition years, not the Harvard-Boston years. During the time of King Khufu, so the builder of the Great Pyramid, these slab stelae or gravestones were the main decoration that was in the tombs of all these high officials around the pyramids. They did not have large decorated chapels with beautifully carved and painted walls yet. That would come later. So slab stelae, and one other piece of burial equipment that was common in the tombs of Khufu's era was called the reserve heads or portrait heads. These are amazing pieces. They were never parts of complete statues, and they seem to break the rules of Egyptian art because they seem to show individual likenesses. Many people like to argue that Egyptian art is functional, practical. It's burial equipment. It is not the individual expression of individual artists. But you can see when you take a look at these that they really are very special, very unique, each one showing an individual likeness. So reserve heads or portrait heads, they were found in disturbed contexts, usually at the bottom of burial shafts. So with these and slab stele, you have most of the decoration that was at Giza under the reign of Khufu. That will change later on as the tombs become more elaborate, have more chapels, more decorated walls, and more inscriptions. Well, after working in the Western Cemetery for a while, up until about 1906, Reisner moved over to the Menkaure Pyramid Complex. And where the green circle is where he started, the Pyramid Temple on the east side of Menkaure. And then later he would go down this long causeway and work at the Valley Temple. Every royal pyramid had all of these elements to them. He also told his Egyptian photographer to climb 1/3 of the way up the Pyramid of Menkaure and take a photograph of the progress of the expedition every evening. When I read that, I thought, this is a time-lapse movie waiting to happen. So I put all of these photographs together and I was able to try to create the progress of the dig. So you're looking at the end of 1906 and the beginning of 1907, and you see how the Menkaure Pyramid Temple is slowly being cleared away and all of these chambers are opened up. It's an amazing way of thinking ahead as early as 1906 or 7. I was just at Giza, as I mentioned, last February, and I was standing outside the temple and noticing the area where outside the temple, George Reisner found this amazing head, and then inside the temple, he found more parts of the body. And this is a colossal statue of King Menkaure. It's the largest Old Kingdom royal statue found, and it's in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston today. It went through different types of reconstructions in the Museum of Fine Arts. You can see George Reisner's daughter there on the left for scale. And in the lower right-hand corner, this is the way it looks today in the museum galleries. Well, after the Pyramid Temple, Reisner was working in Samaria, Palestine, and even in the Sudan as well. He was juggling 3 different expeditions around 1909 and 10. But eventually he moved on to the Valley Temple. And this was an amazing piece of archaeology. You can see how complex it is. The different colors show the different building phases. It was even occupied later on at the end of the Old Kingdom. So you have funerary archaeology, you have settlement archaeology, and in various rooms of this temple, Reisner found so much royal statuary of King Menkaure. Today, it is divided between the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Cairo Museum. So, for example, these incredible triads, there are 4 of them, 1 in Boston and 3 in the Cairo Museum. If you can go there, absolutely take a visit and look at these. They're absolutely spectacular. And they were found by Reisner's assistant, Oric Bates, in the photograph that you see down below. But this was not all. This is 1908. In 1910, in a so-called robber's hole in the temple, maybe that's not the right word, another incredible statue was found. This is the dyad or pair statue of Menkaure, and either a queen or a goddess or perhaps his mother. My colleague Mark Lehner of Ancient Egypt Research Associates has been re-exploring the Menkaure Valley Temple, and we are learning a lot more about what Reisner found all the way back in January of 1910. Come to Boston to the Museum of Fine Arts and you can see these masterpieces of Old Kingdom sculpture today in a beautiful installation in a first floor gallery. Well, Reisner worked in the Sudan for many, many seasons, and not much was happening at Giza between 1915 and about 1924. And he realized he should go home to Harvard to teach a semester. So he told his team, I want you guys to start working in the Eastern Cemetery now, on the east side of the Great Pyramid. I don't expect you to find anything so important. I will be back in Boston. Let me know if anything happens. Well, surprise, surprise. When the team was working and the photographers were in this area, they noticed that the legs of the camera tripod sank into the limestone bedrock, and it was not bedrock at all. It was plaster covering. It was hiding something, the shaft and staircase that you see in the photograph. So they went down and down and down, 30 meters, 90 feet. No one has been down here since 1927, but this is the shaft today. I took this quick little movie in February, just a few months ago, and all the way down at the bottom, what did they find? An unfinished burial chamber, very simple, but filled with deteriorated material, gold, hieroglyphs, strange poles on top of this amazing alabaster sarcophagus, ceramics, stone vessels. In fact, Reisner's friend, the painter, Joseph Lyndon Smith, made this oil painting based on black and white photographs. And everyone said, we better stop the excavation until George Reisner comes back from Boston, because he's the one who knows how to clear something this complicated. So the team spent about 1.5 years lying on mattresses, picking up every tiny little piece, photographing it, drawing it, giving it a number, and bit by bit, they cleared the floor of all this material until they were finally ready to open the sarcophagus and look inside. And because they were so careful, it allowed them to reconstruct what they had. What was this place? It seems to be the burial, or at least the burial equipment, of King Khufu's mother, Queen Hetaperis. A beautiful canopy bedroom set, a bed, a headrest, a couple of chairs, carrying chairs, some gold vessels, amazing things. And you're looking at new wood and then original ancient gilding. There were butterfly inlaid bracelets, alabaster or calcite vessels. Many of these are in the Cairo Museum, but they've just been moved to the new Grand Egyptian Museum, so you'll be able to see them there. An amazing discovery. Unfortunately, when they finally opened the sarcophagus and looked inside, it was empty, to everyone's great surprise. So it's still a bit of a mystery. What is this burial shaft, G7000X? Was it a tomb? Was it just a deposit for burial equipment? We may never know. Another great discovery was in the Eastern Cemetery, and this area shows the largest tomb in the East. So where Hetaperis is located is indicated by one arrow, and this large tomb on the east belongs to Ankh-haf. He has become famous again, first for the discovery of this orange bust, this amazingly lifelike portrait with a balding or receding hairline, bags under the eyes. This is a high official with connections to the royal family who has a hard job. So this masterpiece now in Boston is one reason Ankh-haf is famous. But around 2013, he became famous again when papyri were discovered on the Red Sea coast at Wadi al-Jarf, and they contain some of the most amazing texts. These are the oldest papyri that we have from Egypt so far. And they talk about transport of materials to Giza. They mention Ankh-haf. They mention an inspector by the name Merer. And we learn all about transport, how much time it takes to go from one destination to another, the materials they're bringing. These have been discovered by Pierre Tallet, and he is now publishing the translations, and we've made great progress so far. And so Ankh-haf was a very important person overseeing the construction of part of the Great Pyramid. Well, in dealing with Giza, those are just a few of the highlights. We have two different data sets to worry about. One is the material that is still at Giza. So the beautiful decorated tombs that you see here, we need to document them, record them, publish them, translate them. Everything you might want to know about civilization in Old Kingdom Egypt is preserved here. Scenes that tell you about livestock and costume and Egyptian grammar and texts, and ceramics and stone vessels and work in the fields and agriculture, everything. So that's at the site. And then, of course, there are the thousands and thousands of objects that came from the site that are now in museums all over the world. Why is this so important to work at Giza? Well, I can show you some comparison photographs then and now, and you can see what's happening. This is no one's fault. This is the passage of time. It's climate change. It's all kinds of problems. So we need to do the most amount we can to try to document the site before it's too late. Here is a photograph of some of the archives that George Reisner left behind. So 45,000 glass plate photographic negatives, thousands of drawings and plans, manuscript pages, diaries, architectural renderings. And so back in 2000, I was working as a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston at the time, and we were thinking, how can we work with this material? How can we make it accessible? It's overwhelming. So we realized, let's take the individual tomb as the center of our universe, and let's link everything that relates to that one tomb. And then when you search for a tomb, you get all the related material, photographs, important statues, diary notes, drawings, publications, unpublished notes, and manuscripts. So this is what became the Giza Archives Project, and then later at Harvard University, the Giza Project, a way to try to link all this material together. So if you're interested in Tomb 2000, or a statue in Boston, or a stela in Cairo, you can get all of the related information. After a while, I realized it's great to have everything from Reisner's Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition, but what about the other expeditions that worked at Giza? The Italian one, the German one, later an Egyptian one. So I traveled all through Europe and I convinced my colleagues in all of these museums to share their material with us, and we added it to our Giza website. And you can freely access this material today. So here is the website address, giza.fas.harvard.edu, and you can search for tombs, you can search for objects, or you can do this sort of 3D modeling now and look for highlights, like going into the tomb of Queen Merisonk, and you can see our reconstruction model. And with the button down below, you can switch back and forth between the way the tomb actually looks today and our reconstructed model. So you can see how we've restored all of these colors. So many exciting ways to access the site of Giza today, whether you are at the site or whether you are at home. How do we build on this incredible legacy that George Reisner left behind? We have to think in multiple dimensions and in multiple time periods, not just the way the site looks now, but we have to be able to imagine how it was in the Fourth Dynasty, or how it was in 1910 or 1925 of our era, so we can understand it better. So this is what the Giza Project is all about. And we are not only gathering all the old traditional archaeological material, but we're experimenting with new technologies wherever we can. We work with colleagues who do 3D modeling. We have nonprofit and profit consulting that we do. Here is a product made by my colleagues at Emissive in Paris. This is an experience where you can go to Giza, put on a computer backpack and headset, and have an interesting experience. You can become a giant at Giza. You can be taken inside the Great Pyramid to wander around. We would love to make every tomb accessible in the same way that real estate websites can show you an apartment or a house, and you can wander through the kitchen or the bedroom. Why not through a Giza tomb to experience what it's like to go inside? Especially when these tombs are not open to the public, this is a wonderful way to make them accessible. From the empty, ancient view of tombs like this, we can also start to reconstruct what it's like to be at Giza in the Fourth Dynasty. So here is a reconstruction of King Khufu's funeral ceremony. This is called the opening of the mouth ceremony, where the mummy of the dead king is ritually brought back to life. These are difficult to do because when you reconstruct a model like this, it brings up so many questions. What time of day should it be? How many people were invited to this ceremony? Is it inside the temple or is it somewhere else? What kind of costume are they wearing? Lots of interesting questions that scholars perhaps have not thought about before. We tried another interesting experiment with the tomb of Hediperis. So we were just down at the bottom of this shaft reconstructing all the material, but there was one chair that the excavators knew about, but they could not figure out how to put it back together. It was just too complicated. Until 1949, and that is when one of George Reisner's successors made an archaeological drawing and figured out what it should look like. Down below, we're wandering into the tomb as it might have looked in the Fourth Dynasty, where all of the material is still in good condition before the wood deteriorated. And you can see there are two chairs. One of them is well known, but the other one is not. It has these falcon arms and is really quite fancy. You see the drawings made in 1949 down below. Well, we thought, if we can make a computer model of the chair, why don't we try to make the real thing? No one has seen this second, more elaborate chair. So we studied the tiny fragments in storage in the Cairo Museum, and then we connected our computer model to a drilling machine that you see in the upper right, and it's carving real cedar wood. There it is, carving the arm of the chair, because we are not great craftsmen, so we needed the computer. And eventually we learned how to make blue faience tiles, and we got some real gold for the gilding, and we actually put this chair together, and it is on display in my museum at Harvard University, the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. Another area I'm very interested in is called Harvard Camp. This is the dig house where Reisner lived most of his life. Even when he worked in the Sudan, it was Harvard Camp was his headquarters, and all the objects came here to be studied and published and photographs. It was just a series of very simple buildings that you see here, and there was no electricity, there was no plumbing, but he was very happy and comfortable here. And I was able to label all the buildings. After a lot of research, I found out what they were all for. And in the courtyard, there are always statues and objects and things. Here is a view of some of the interior rooms. So I thought this could be a good archaeological teaching tool. So we made a model of Harvard Camp. And there it is today with the courtyard filled with materials. Unfortunately, Harvard Camp does not exist anymore. It has been dismantled because of part of the tourist road. But you can see that it's quite an archaeological experience. Now people can get to understand how the expedition worked, how they processed the objects and recorded them. I do a lot of teaching with this material at Harvard. We have a special visualization lab classroom, and we can view the site in 3D or go to the Harvard Camp model. Here is another way we've been playing with Harvard Camp. You can see the illusion here. I'm actually standing at Harvard University, but it looks like I'm standing in the courtyard of Harvard Camp. And as the camera moves around to the back of the computer screen, you can see the illusion. It's two walls and a floor in projection, and it looks like I'm actually standing there. So down below, I can use my iPad and I can bring up an object and I can resize it, make it larger or smaller. I can rotate it. We can study the hieroglyphs on it. So these are interesting courses, and it has been a privilege for me to teach at Harvard. Some of the courses are very big. There's a lot of interest in ancient Egypt. I also did an online course that HarvardX or edX has released. This is a free online course called The Pyramids of Giza. And over the years, it is a free course. It runs at your own pace, doesn't cost anything. And we've had great success, about 124,000 people from all over the world, about 140 countries or so. So an interesting way to try to reach larger groups. Something else we did at my museum, the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, is we have a reproduction of the great dream stela of Thutmose IV. So the original ancient stela still stands between the legs of the Sphinx at Giza. It's 1,000 years later than the Sphinx. So if the Sphinx is 2400 BCE or so, this stela is about 1400 BCE or so. So we wanted to tell the story of the stela. The stela talks about a prince of the New Kingdom, and he takes a nap in the shadow of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx appears to him in a dream and basically says, if you will clear the sand away, I will make you pharaoh, I will make you king. So we created an app that you can use on your phone, and it creates this nice animation here, and the Sphinx comes along and tells the prince what to do, take the sand away and make me king. And then even more fun, you can aim your phone at the stela in the gallery, and it will project in augmented reality these lines of text. And in English, you can read the translation line by line of the entire stela. I would love to translate this into Japanese and many other languages and make it a truly international experience. We also have a way to stand in virtual reality by the Sphinx right in between there, and you can move at different periods in time, from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, see the colors change, see the stela get added in the New Kingdom 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved. We're also experimenting with 3D scanning, of course, to try to create 3D models of that. There are different technologies now. One of them I love is called Gaussian splats. So instead of polygons, now we're using kinds of dots to create our 3D models. This is in the Cairo Museum, and you can see the tourists have all become like ghosts, but the statue of King Khafre, who built the second pyramid, is in very sharp, clear detail and resolution. Once you have scanned these objects, then of course you can 3D print them as well. And this has allowed us great teaching tools. So this was a fun experiment. This head is in Boston, but I knew that the body was in Cairo. So I made a 3D print and I brought it to Cairo with me. And I went to the Grand Egyptian Museum and we tried to match the head to the rest of the body, and it was a perfect fit. And of course, I made the head in this strange blue color because I did not want anyone to think that I was stealing an ancient Egyptian work of art. And I gave this piece to them at the Cairo Museum. So for teaching tools, you can make many of these types of objects and pass them around in class if you're at a university that does not have an Egyptian collection. I don't know where all of this technology is going. It's getting better and more interesting. We will see if the Apple Vision Pro is a revolution or just one more step along the way. But these are exciting times here in this third golden age dealing with Giza. And I'll finish up now by talking about the Egyptians who have done so much to help with these expeditions. In fact, there was one particular family that helped George Reisner so much. They came from a town called Kuft in Middle Egypt or Upper Egypt, and these men became the foremen. They helped run the expedition. They kept the accounts. They kept the men in line. They kept diaries, in fact. It was amazing. And this particular man started carrying George Reisner's camera bag, but then became a photographer and then became his chief foreman or Rayas. And even his sons, who you see here, Muhammad and Mahmud, who were the sons of Sayyid Ahmed Diraz, they stepped into their father's shoes and they helped Reisner to run the expedition all the way to the end. Well, years ago, I was very interested to try to find any children of these people to know if they had any photographs or stories about the expedition. And I was very lucky to find this man. He was the son of Muhammad Diraz, and it was a pleasure to meet him. And he said to me, well, I have this. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, it's an Arabic diary kept by my father and my uncle. And I was amazed to see this. And he said, well, if you like that, I have 73 more of these books in the village in Upper Egypt. And so we negotiated to bring them to Boston and to scan them and study them. And I now have a second project, in addition to the Giza project, which is to study these amazing Arabic diaries kept by his family that document not just Giza, but the sites in Deir el-Bersha and other sites in Egypt and sites in the Sudan as well. They are incredible documents that no other expedition has, about 6,000 or 7,000 pages. And we now have an Arabic diaries project. So these Egyptian foremen were recording the progress of the dig every day. Sometimes they were even copying hieroglyphs from stele. And we've been able to use AI to transcribe all of this handwritten Arabic into typed up Arabic that you see on the right. So my team right now is completing the corrections for all of this computer-generated transcribed Arabic, and then we will work on the translations and make a website where anyone can study these documents and learn so much from the Egyptian point of view about the expedition. Well, I must, in closing, also mention the fantastic Japanese work that has happened at Giza over so many decades, so many great scholars who have worked there and done so much to help with our knowledge of Giza. It isn't just Europeans, it isn't just Americans, it isn't just Egyptians, but Japanese contribution has been fantastic, working with the boats that were associated with the Great Pyramid, Dr. Yoshimura, and so much work that he has done. A recent expedition that is now in the Western Cemetery and has found some underground anomalies with their resistivity surveys, and that's pretty interesting too. And then, of course, Dr. Kawai, who has worked with Mark Lehner and now on his own doing so much great scanning and photogrammetry work, particularly with Menkaure's pyramid, to help us understand more about how Giza was built, how it came together. And of course, we cannot forget the Grand Egyptian Museum, which was done in partnership with Japan. And that will open soon, I hope, very soon. I was there in February and had a chance to look inside and ride the escalator and see the beautiful statuary and columns and architectural pieces that were put on view and are just waiting for the public to come in and enjoy. It's an amazing museum. It is huge. And the Tutankhamun treasures have moved here. Many thousands of objects have been removed to this museum from the Cairo Museum downtown, but the Cairo Museum is still very important and very worth a visit. Well, over the last many years, I was researching the expedition and the life of George Reisner and was happy to publish a biography of his life. but I'm interested in trying to reach different audiences. So this book is 1,000 pages long. It's perhaps not for everyone. So I've been exploring with different ways to make short videos and perhaps try to make the site more accessible and tell the story of Reisner's life and the expedition and some of the great discoveries. And I'm working on these now, and I will put them on YouTube so that people can have access to the different parts of Reisner's life, the ups and the downs, the triumphs and the challenges. And it's been a very interesting learning experience for me to try to take elements of his life and make them accessible and explain them clearly. And now, again, with AI, we can translate my voice into Japanese or Chinese or Spanish or other languages. So perhaps one day all of these videos will be available in any language that you might choose. These new technologies are so exciting, but they all rest on the foundation provided by Reisner and his very careful archaeological work and his documentation, the photographs, the notes, the plans, the drawings. Without this foundation, it would be impossible to do all of the exciting, immersive, and virtual reality and augmented reality and photogrammetry work that we're doing today. So we look forward to collaboration with the Egyptians. We'd love to have more collaboration with our Japanese colleagues. And to close up, I will just thank some of the partners who have been involved and have helped us over so many years to put all of this material together. It's never completely finished. There are more excavations and more knowledge coming out of Giza every single year. And it's never quite up to date. We can't quite get up to speed and be up to date with everything that's happening. But over the future years, I hope that we will be able to add more and more material and keep the Giza project and the Giza website continuing to be a contribution to knowledge about ancient Egyptian civilization. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and my best regards to all of my Japanese colleagues on the other side of the world.
はい、ご視聴ありがとうございました。これからもですね、どんどん良質な古代エジプトの、コンテンツを上げていきたいと思いますので、引き続きいいねボタンとチャンネル登録よろしくお願いします。